Perhaps it would be helpful at this time to look at a model of Jung's understanding of the psyche. Remember, this is only a general format. Every person is individual in their actual dreaming and in their actual process. But this is how he saw the general pattern. If we take this circle as the self that includes the known, the unknown, everything. And if we hold this line as the threshold of consciousness, by threshold, I mean it's that space when you're waking up, when you just come over into this world, or you can fall back into sleep. Here is the unconscious, here is the so-called world of consciousness. Between those two is this little tiny ego. Tiny little thing. And yet all of our world, our reality, moves through that space. It's partly in the unconscious, partly in consciousness. In the unconscious, as Jung understood it, there are these floating islands in this vast sea. And these are known as the complexes. They are energy centers, and they have at their core what he calls archetypes. And those archetypes are immense energy, divine energy, that have the power to knock the ego right out. They also, however, are essential to human beings in that it's from that archetypal world that poetry, music, all the great arts come. And of course, religion is from that space. Now the complex comes into action when something out here in the ordinary world attracts it. I'll use an addict as an example because it's so clear with an addiction. Supposing I had no loving mother. Not because she didn't love me, my mother, but because through her generations behind her, she didn't know how to look at me as I was, or at me as, she saw me as she wanted to be, but it wasn't my reality. So somewhere along the line, I developed a craving for sweetness, a craving for nourishment, for life. I happened to put this onto chocolate or any other food that was sweet and could give me that feeling of being loved. So I see the chocolate. I want the chocolate. If I have a weak ego, the ego cannot tell me, no, you shouldn't have any more chocolate. So I come past the ego and go for the chocolate. I go right up through that unchallenged line. Supposing I try to say to myself, I won't have the chocolate. It may be that the archetype will say, I will. And I don't care what you think, what your ego wants to do, I want the chocolate. I've always had the chocolate. I always will have it, and I will go direct to the chocolate. The ego has been wiped out, and we are really in a complex situation. From the Jungian point of view, this is a very dangerous space to be in because the ego has lost its power, the complex is taken over, and the archetypal energy is at work. Now, in a well-working psyche, the ego is strong enough to hold that complex in abeyance. And yes, let it develop, let it mature, but not to allow the archetype to take over. The archetype will be more powerful than the ego later on. When, for example, you have an ego strong enough to write, well trained that it can play music, and the ego can be forgotten while the archetypal energy is moving through. Or in prayer, for example, the ego is out of the road, the prayer is coming through. The archetypal energy is essential to life in the dimension that we as human beings relate to it. The tragedy in our culture is that so many people do not believe in symbolic language. And so they try to satisfy a spiritual yearning with a physical food or alcohol or drugs or silk underwear, whatever the addiction is. That cannot work. There is no satiation point for a spiritual longing by physical means. So long as that symbol is not alive as a living symbol, it cannot do its work to bring us into our totality. This series is really a short course in Jungian psychology. We start out with an understanding of the shadow. In Jungian terms, the shadow is the same gender as the ego. It is the part of us that we do not know. It's in the unconscious. And we must remember, unconscious means unconscious, not knowing. There's something that wants to come through, tell us something, and we must recognize that every dream is giving us something new from the unconscious. So the shadow is that part of us that we do not know. Or it may be a part of us that was buried when we were very, very young. For whatever reason, we didn't have a chance to live that side. We were shamed for it. We were humiliated. We weren't in our own peer group. And so we stepped away from it and buried it and hoped we would never see it again. The other side of the shadow is the bright, creative, full of vibrant life shadow. The creature that is hidden within us, who has never dared to come out. Or, as a child, when it dared to come out, we were told, we don't do those kind of things here. And we knew that we had done something wrong. But if that shadow does emerge, that creative shadow, everything may become, yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Physical energy works like psychic energy. For example, if we take these two little magnets, and I have the like poles, and I'm trying to bring those poles together. They absolutely refuse to meld. If I bring the negative, it's instantaneous. They automatically want to clip into each other. Think of yourself at a party, and you see someone and you say, of all the people at this party, that's the one I don't want to get involved with. But all the time you know where he is in the room, and he knows where you are in the room. And those two energies are coming together. That's how life brings us to our own reality. In Jung's understanding, there is a natural gradient towards wholeness, not towards perfection, but towards knowing all of ourselves, to recognize the darkest corners as well as the light corners, and to recognize, as Blake said, without contraries is no progression. You need that grain of sand there to cause that continual grind. You need that world of contraries to bring out the very best of your strength. And that natural gradient will go through and try to pick that up. That is true both negatively and positively. I like to think of that natural gradient towards wholeness as the two snakes in the yogic world. If you imagine the one is the masculine, the other the feminine, the one begins to move, finds the strength, the other begins to move, and they move to a point of meeting. They kiss, then they have to separate. The one may become stronger, the other is then forced into a place of strength, and they work their way through till they come again to meeting. And again they kiss, recognize each other, and again they must separate. And so they go through that third round. And at the top, they meet in the divine embrace. The process is a natural evolution of growing together, separating, opening into a further individuality so that each is allowed to come to their own wholeness within and within the relationship. And now we are going to look at the structure of a dream. I think it's very important to realize that the archetypal structure in narrative is the same in a simple dream as it is in a classical play. It is in us that structuring of the archetypal energy. Take, for example, Macbeth. Very simple plot. We have the introduction, the rising action. I'm sure you all learned this in grade 12. The climax, the denouement, and the end of the dream is the lysis. That little part on the end that tells us where the energy wants to go. There are 5 parts to a classical play. And if we could remember the entire dream, there would be 5 parts there, but very few of us can remember them. Most of us just get the lysis. But that is very, very important, as you will see in a moment. In the introduction, we are given the characters, the plot, and the setting. We see that there may be some kind of conflict developing even in the introduction, but it is highlighted as it moves through the rising action. Two conflicting energies begin to meet. Then they come to the climax, and something happens there that turns the energy of the play. So that you begin to see whether the outcome is going to be good for the hero, quotation marks, or whether he is going to be destroyed. For example, Macbeth, everything seems to be going on his side until he gets to this climax. And Macbeth makes a decision. And here is what he says. I am in blood steeped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. Strange things I have in head which will to hand, which must be acted ere they may be scanned. That is his decision, and the rest of the play is the outcome of that decision. It is a tragedy. So that tragedy begins to develop in what is known as the denouement, and gradually he comes to the place where he loses all. His head is taken off. In the lysis of the play, we know that there's going to be a new king. We know who that's going to be, and the hero is dead. Now, in a dream, this lysis is terribly important. Let me give you an example. A man dreams that he's been walking through a jungle, and he's been into one ambush after another in that jungle. And he goes through the jungle cutting off one big leaf, steps through. He has no idea where he's going, but he just keeps cutting off one leaf. And gradually he comes to a river. And he is so happy to be at the river. Finally, he's finished with the jungle. He looks across the river, and behold, there's a jungle on the other side. That does him in. He can't go any further. And then he realizes that somebody has been cutting through the jungle on the other side, coming to meet him. That divine presence has been coming through on the other side, and so he has the strength to go on. The lysis will carry the energy into the next place of action. Often we only get the lysis of the dream, but if we get even that, we know where our energy is trying to go. We are left breathless if we follow our dreams and really understand symbol. Let's go to Macbeth again. When Macbeth hears that his wife is dead, he says, she should have died hereafter. He says this about the woman who came to meet him at the very beginning of the play with all her love and passion expressed in one word, my husband. However, After the servant leaves, when he's had the news, he launches into that great soliloquy, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. Out, out, brief candle. Now, any of you who have watched a loved one die, take their last breath, understand brief candle. The whole body just shrivels into ice. The warmth, the vitality, the light, finished. And you are faced with the enormity of the mystery of death. That tiny little phrase, brief candle, brings together the intellect, the feeling, the imagination, and for one moment you are whole. That Jung says that without the archetypal image, there is no healing, because the harmonic is in the totality of the symbol that can bring you into a wholeness that acts as a tuning fork for where you are going to go next. Our unconscious is often imaged as a vast ocean. Some people go fishing every night. Some catch a minnow, some catch a whale. Some don't go with any fishing gear. They're not interested in fish and not interested in trying to catch one. Other people are very interested in catching a fish. They bring up that unconscious content in order to relate to it, in order to open up their vision into a very new place. The old symbols will not move us into a new vision, a new place in ourselves where we can see life in a new way. And so we live with that symbol that is operating as an energy source in our body. Sometimes we have to remember Keats' phrase, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. It takes courage and faith to try to remember those unheard melodies. I think of a businessman, for example, who is up to his ears in glass and concrete. And one night he has a dream, a compensating dream. This is one of the great things about dreams. They compensate for an over-exaggerated attitude and consciousness. So this businessman has a dream about the pond he used to fish in when he was a boy. And the trilling of a bird brings him into a place in himself where he can hear those songs, those unheard songs. Can he sing that song? Dare he sing that song? In our Western culture, our psyches and our DNA are filled with Christian and Jewish symbolism. It is really important when you're studying dreams that you recognize your own heritage and honor it, because it will be manifesting in ways that you could never have imagined. It is important when you are looking at a culture and the individuals within that culture that you look into the foundations. For example, in our culture, the foundations have been in dreams. In the Jewish world, in the Old Testament, kings, prophets, leaders listened to their dreams. In the New Testament, Mary listened to the inner voice, bore a divine child, and her husband Joseph was told to take the mother and child to Egypt in a dream. He obeyed and saved their lives. The great biblical figures wrestled with their angels, and they either surrendered or found a new meaning for their lives. It's no small thing to be met by an angel, especially if the angel wants you to do something that the ego does not want to do. Sooner or later, we realize that we are walking down a path. As my dear old Dr. Bennett used to say, well, Mrs. Woodman, you're going to walk that path whether you like it or not. You can either go like a squealing pig being dragged to the slaughter, or you can muster as much dignity and grace as you can.